Welcome to the Fiber Plus Pulp virtual panel. This panel is part of programming for the Fiber Plus Pulp exhibition that's on exhibit at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking, and it's currently on view through June 10th. Tonight, we'll be in conversation with Renewable Bioproduct Institute faculty Losego, Chris Muhlstein, and Meisha Shofner. We'll be hearing a little bit about material science and how paper, fibers, and pulp are on the cutting edge of today's manufacturing economy. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to say we've got a Q&A there that you can put questions as our presenters are talking, and then we'll cover the questions at the end after all three presenters have had an opportunity to speak. So Dr. Mark Losego is an associate professor and MSE faculty fellow in the School of Materials Science and Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. The Losego Lab focuses on materials processing and developing novel organic, inorganic, hybrid materials for sustainable energy, national security, and technical textile applications. Professor Losego has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and 2 awarded patents. He has also been recognized with multiple awards, including the 3M Non-Tenured Faculty Award and Georgia Tech's Outstanding Undergraduate Research Mentor Award. He's also the faculty founder for the Materials Innovation and Learning Laboratory, which is an open access student-run make and measure space for experimental education in materials science. He received his BS degree from Penn State University and his MS and PhD from North Carolina State University, all in materials sciences and engineering. Dr. Christopher Muhlstein has worked as an engineering consultant at Exponent Inc., a failure analysis associates. In September 2002, he joined the faculty in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at the Pennsylvania State University and was tenured and promoted to associate professor in 2008. Dr. Muhlstein's research focuses on understanding the mechanisms of fracture and fatigue in bulk and thin film materials. He's a member of Alpha Sigma Mu and the Karamus Honor Societies, as well as National Science Foundation Career Award recipient. In 2007, he was also named the Corning Research Faculty Fellow in Materials Science and Engineering at the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Meisha Shofner is an associate professor in the School of Materials Science and Engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology, joined the faculty following postdoctoral training at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She received her BS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and her PhD in Materials Science from Rice University. Prior to beginning grad school, she was employed as a design engineer at FMC in the Subsea Engineering Division, working at 2 plant locations, Houston, Texas, and the Republic of Singapore. And she is a registered professional engineer in Georgia. All right. And the first person you'll hear from is Dr. Mark Losego.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks for inviting me to share some of the research we do in my lab at Georgia Tech involving fiber, pulp, and paper. The story I'll tell you today is sort of how we use microelectronics manufacturing to modify the surface chemistry of fiber, pulp, paper, wood, and other cellulosic products. And as mentioned, I'm an associate professor of material science here at Georgia Tech. And much of this work was actually financially supported through the Renewable Bioproducts Institute funds. So, very generally, if you look at a piece of paper, it's a fibrous material made up of primarily cellulosic fibers. And what we do in my lab primarily is look at how we can modify the surface chemistry of those fibers, of each of those individual fibers within, for example, a piece of paper. And so, right at the surface of those fibers, there's certain atoms on the surface, and what we want to do is effectively modify, add basically an additional layer of atoms onto the surface. And by adding that additional layer of atoms, we can influence the properties of that paper. And I say one layer of atoms, that's a bit of hyperbole. We're probably talking more like 5 to 10, 20 layers of atoms onto the surface. But still, when you sort of interact with that paper, it doesn't really change its mechanical properties or its appearance. It really feels just like normal paper because we've only added a few atoms to the surface of all those fibers. So it's really a very minor modification, essentially imperceptible modification of the paper, but it can have dramatic influences on the properties of that paper. So, for example, this is a piece of untreated cellulosic paper where we dropped a droplet of water, in this case dyed yellow, just to allow us to see it a little bit better. And this is on untreated paper, but if we modify it with this sort of one layer of atoms, with these treatments that we do, we're able to convert that paper to being hydrophobic or repelling of water. And we see the water, these yellow water beads, these dyed water beads, bead up on the surface of the paper rather than wick and wet into the paper itself. So there's a lot of things that you can actually modify with just a single layer of atoms. And sort of this magic treatment that we're doing is a process that's commonly used in making all of your microelectronics. Think of your computers, your laptops you're watching this on, or your cell phones. And that treatment's called atomic layer deposition, or I'll use the acronym ALD. And just give a brief history of what atomic layer deposition is, ALD, where it's used. This is actually from this website, atomiclimits.com, which is maintained by a group in Europe that's well known for ALD research. And if you like to learn more, I actually encourage you to go look at the Atomic Limits website. It's a great website resource for information on ALD. But sort of two dates here I'll point out to you. In the late 90s, your random access memory started to incorporate ALD films, coatings, into that random access memory to make them work. They began to be deposited by this ALD process. And then around 2007, 2008, that's when all of your microelectronics, all of the circuits that are in your computer, that basically are the brains of your computer, the transistors in there, started to be made with an ALD layer in them. So Intel integrated this ALD layer in about 2007, 2008. So every computer, every laptop, HD TV, everything, any electronic component you've owned that's been manufactured since about 2008 or so, 2007, 2008, has been manufactured using atomic layer deposition. Now you might say, well, ALD, this sounds like a fancy sort of process, and certainly to do microelectronics, you do need to be very careful. But if you just want to modify surface chemistry, you don't need the precision of the perfect coatings that you need in a microelectronics process. You can still use this and get pretty well enhanced effects, like I showed in that previous slide of modifying the paper in much sort of dirtier manufacturing conditions. You can still get dramatic changes in the properties of materials. So how does atomic layer deposition work? This is a sort of a simple animation of a surface of any sort of material, the atoms that sit on that surface. And in an ALD process, what we do is we bring in gases of a metal organic species, and these metal-containing molecules, this red atom here, this red sphere here is the metal-containing species, and these are the organic ligands that are attached to it. They'll react with the surface chemistry of your material, and you get a bond, and you get some byproducts being removed. And so what we can do is bring in a lot of these precursors, allow them to react with the surface, but these gray species, these ligands on the metal atoms, are preventing these precursors, these molecular precursors, from reacting with themselves. And so we get a self-termination, basically a self-limiting based on the chemistry of just reacting one atomic layer on the surface, but not reacting beyond that because of these ligands blocking further reaction with themselves. And so what we can do then is purge off any excess, leaving us just a single atomic layer of material on the surface. We can then come in with what we call a co-reactant, another gaseous species that can again react with the surface chemistry that's available, but not react with itself, such that we then get self-limited termination of the atomic layer that we put on that surface. And we can, then imagine bring in these red atoms again, and repeat this over and over until we, build up atomic layer by atomic layer the coating that we want on the surface. And there's a number of virtues that people will talk about with ALD. The first is that because it's a gaseous process, these gases can permeate all types of structures. So you see sort of coatings that were done in various three-dimensional structures. And so this is why for fibrous materials like paper, we can actually use this process to conformally coat all of the surfaces of all the fibers inside of the paper. Similarly, what you saw there with sort of that animation was that we're putting down one atomic layer at a time. So we have very high precision in terms of the thickness. We can deposit one atomic layer, we can deposit 25 atomic layer, 27. We can be very precise in how much material we're depositing on the surface using an ALD process. And finally, it just happens that a lot of these chemistries react at fairly low temperatures, so we're able to deposit on temperature-sensitive types of materials like paper and other polymers like textiles, because we don't need to do these processes at very high temperatures, often well below 100 degrees Fahrenheit or around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Yeah, so what does this process look like? It's fairly simple. You have a vacuum chamber, so basically a stainless steel container that's attached to a vacuum pump that we can suck the air out of the chamber, and these here are valves. And so what we do is we open the valve for the pump, we suck out all the air out of the chamber. We then backfill that chamber with this gaseous precursor that we want to use to react with the surfaces and coat the surfaces of our material, and then we wait for the reaction to happen. We then again evacuate out that precursor, and then we vent it to atmosphere. Of course, before venting, we may cycle this process multiple times depending on how many layers we want to put down. But overall, this is the basic process that we use to modify fibrous materials and all types of materials, actually. So this is what we actually build these reactors in my lab. We build the software to run them, the hardware that controls them, and then the actual vacuum chambers with the pumps and so on. And so this is what one looks like. Gases flow sort of through this tube. Samples that we coat sit sort of in the tube here. It's being heated to give us the reaction temperatures we need. And in fact, we have about 8 different reactors in our chamber, and we have a bit of fun with naming them because I can never remember reactor 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So we've given them names of Star Wars characters to make it a little easier. But so we have a number of reactors that are similar, but some have different capabilities. We have reactors, for example, that give us in situ data about the process and what's happening during the process. And then we have other reactors that are very large. That's the advantage, that then we can put large quantities of materials, large volumes of materials into those reactors. So a little bit here to sort of wrap up is to talk about atomic layer deposition on fiber, pulp, and paper. We can do ALD on a number of cellulosic products. Examples here: cotton balls, bandages, denim, nanocellulose, cardboard, and wood. And what we find is that when we coat these, they become hydrophobic. They repel water. They actually float on water. The untreated ones soak up water, and it happens. It's actually fairly stable. It exists for over a year. We've had these floating on water. And if you rip this cotton ball in half, for example, the fibers inside are just as repelling of water as the fibers on the outside. And in addition to that, They're also oilophilic. They actually soak up oil, and so we can use them for oil spill remediation. And so what you're seeing here is the untreated one. We do get some soaking of the oil, but over time it actually releases the oil, whereas our treated one will only soak up the oil and not soak up very much water at all. And we can use this for oil spill remediation purposes. Finally, one other example here is we do an ALD process on paper. Because the paper is a bit smoother overall relative to the cotton balls, what we find is that after we do the ALD, the paper actually still wets until we do a heat treatment to it. And if we selectively heat treat, a pattern onto that paper, it actually makes only part of the paper hydrophobic and part of it not hydrophobic. So part of it sucks up water and part of it does not. And so we can create patterns of where we get wicking of the water into the paper. And so this is just sort of the process here, and you can see in the final product how quickly it soaks up in where we've patterned it to soak up water and sort of repel that water where we don't want it to. We've also done this on lumber to kind of compete with different treated lumbers to prevent water uptake in bulk wood. And finally, I'll just conclude by saying that hopefully what I've demonstrated here is that even a single layer of atoms can have a lot of influence on the properties of materials. So you can do quite a bit with a few atoms. So thanks again for your attention. I'm happy to turn it over.
Thank you, Mark. That so I've already got several questions. It seems like magic to someone that's not in the lab. I can't wait to discuss it further when we get to our Q&A. We're going to pass this on to Chris.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is a fun session. It's nice to be able to spend some time with people who don't necessarily always see the kind of work that we do. And so I'm really excited to be able to have a chance to share how the work that we do in the lab extends to paper and pulp, and really the kind of long-standing impact that we can have on both the global economy and manufacturing, both in the United States and abroad. So since I arrived at Georgia Tech about 10 years ago, the RBI's made it possible for me to extend my research, which is primarily on structural materials for both aerospace and electronic applications, into the paper and packaging realm. And that extension then means that the RBI has funded a couple of students for me. So the work that you'll be seeing mentioned today comes from two people. Yoonju Na finished her doctoral work about 2 years ago, so she's now Dr. Na. And Sarah Palaskevich is going to be finishing up this coming summer. So my love of paper products, though, certainly extends outside of the laboratory. I am an admitted stationery nerd. So if in the Q&A we digress into discussions of favorite fountain pens and ink and paper, I won't mind. So what we want to do today is think a little bit about how our work influences the global stage. And what we're doing here, whether you're looking at Mark Losego's work or my work or Meisha Shofner's or the other research that's going on at the RBI, is this understanding that natural fibers, especially wood fiber-based products, play an important role in the global economy. And so as we look at this diagram that's pulled out of one of the World Economic Forum reports, and it has wood starting at the left-hand side and a few notes about how much of different types of wood and wood fiber products are flowing through our global economy. I want you to sort of think about two buzzwords that I suspect that you've heard. The first is going to be sustainable, and then the second is circular. And so we're looking at sustainable processes. We're interested in making sure that we're paying attention to the finite amount of resources that we have available, the finite amount of energy, and then the influence that we have on our planet. And then the second is this notion of circularity. And usually those two things are talked about together. And this is an attention to the full life cycle of our products. And this idea of paying attention to the life cycle is important. And paper really is the prototype, because when you look at wood fiber based materials, they're really a perfect opportunity to realize this idea of circularity, because paper is natural. So you can inherently argue in some ways that you should be able to farm it and process it and use it in a way that then, because it is recyclable and compostable, you should be able to close this loop and be able to use it efficiently. And so that's really one of the underlying goals here. Wood fiber-based products play an important role in our process, in our daily lives. And as you notice here on the left-hand side, we have wood fiber coming in. Roughly a third, 20 to 30% of the wood that's coming into our economy is really being pushed into fiber-based applications, whether it's paper that's going to be used as writing materials or primarily in packaging. And really the structural performance and importance of packaging is where I like to focus my attention. So this last idea that we want to think about is what makes paper circular, because that's really our goal. Our goal is to be able to take material into a process, look at its full life cycle, and be smart about how we're using it. There's really a strong economic motivation to do this. There's a real business case that's been made for showing that if you can run a company where you really set up your business to be inherently circular, that you will make more money. And in addition to that, of course, you're going to have a better impact on the world around you. So the goal here when we look at making paper circular is really trying to create what the WEF will call pure material flows. We're trying to close the loop. And so paper is interesting. Here we have a diagram where we show a couple of different loops. On the left-hand side, we have paper for looking at applications where you're going to look at it. So it's for graphical papers. And on the right-hand side, we have some other packaging applications. And what this loop shows is material coming in after we have taken the fibers and pressed them out and dried them. We now put it into production. We think about how we use the product on the left-hand side here. And then as it goes through its life cycle, maybe we get tired of looking at the magazine, we're going to then push that used material back into a sorting process where hopefully we'll recycle it and then use it again. This ability to close the loop, though, is not perfect. And in fact, this is the goal, but we don't do it. You can think of packaging materials shown on the right where that box comes in, whether it's Amazon or UPS or DHL drops it off at your front door, or your local postal service from your country of choice. And that box comes in the door, you use it up, and then you toss it out the back into what you hope is a recycling bin that will push it back into another product in the future. The reality is that this loop that we see in front of us is imperfect, because every trip around this loop that a fiber makes, where it gets recycled and then pushed back into a product, degrades it. And so what my research is doing is looking at how each time we have a new and different kind of fiber, a different processing scheme, how we can then understand the fundamentals behind that so that we can engineer circular products. And ultimately, the goal here is to make this possible. And it's widely recognized that material science and engineering, and materials research, really is going to be the key to making this happen. So what we want to do is think about what the role of fundamental research is in the circular product development. And really what we're thinking about is how to make an impact. So when I look at a specific product, whether it's in a research program or in a consulting job, we're going to be addressing local problems with the recognition that really the results are going to have a broader impact. And specifically, when we have fundamental insights that can be applied to multiple material systems and multiple applications, then we're really going to have the kind of impact that we need. So that's the role that our fundamental work plays. On the right-hand side here is a really cool image from what's called a confocal laser scanning microscope. And this is a three-dimensional view of paper fibers in a copy paper. And these types of imaging technologies can look at both the free surface as well as the interior of the paper and map out where all of those fibers sit. And ultimately, what we're going to find is that understanding where and how those fibers are related to one another is going to be the key to making sure that we can engineer the product performance that we want. And so the examples that I'll talk about today fall into a category that my group calls Strainfield Mining. And what we're going to be doing is imaging paper so that we can understand how it moves and changes shape and ultimately fails. Because what material science and engineering people are trying to do is take the processing, structure, property relationships and master them so that we can control our product, so that we can make the material we want, have it last exactly as long as we want it to, and have it fail and end its useful life in a controlled way. So closing this structure processing property loop requires that we know ideally where all the fibers are, what their shapes and individual properties are, how they're bonded to one another, so that then we can change it. So on the right-hand side, we have a cross-sectional view in the top right-hand corner. This is a cross-section of a piece of copy paper. And what you can see on this cross-section is that the paper, of course, is made up in layers of fibers that are pointed in all sorts of directions. And there's also a lot of other things inside of here. We have a bunch of fillers as well to make it nice and white. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we have a plan view or a top view of the printed surface that you're often looking at. And as Professor Losego was talking about, the three-dimensional structure and the ability to access all the different parts of the paper fiber network are important. So in our case, we're interested in understanding what are the interfiber bonds, what are the spatial distributions of the fibers. So how many fibers do you have in a particular region? So we're interested in the local basis weight of the paper. And then as these agglomerates of fibers or flocks are linked to other areas of the paper, that connectivity is really important so that we can understand and control the global and local property. When people look at the mechanical properties of paper, you're immediately going to gravitate towards things like boxes and other applications for packaging. And the thing to remember when we're looking at paper is that the properties are rarely the same in all different directions. The properties are anisotropic. And this is a natural byproduct of how we know that paper is made, because commercial paper shown on this diagram here on the left-hand side starts out wet. So you load your fibers, whatever sort of flavor of plant fiber you like, and then you can push them through into the slurry down onto the felt, drain out that water, dry it, and squish and squeeze and calendar your paper so that the surfaces look as you like. And if the result of this is that as we push the paper through along what we'll call the machine direction, the fibers are going to tend to preferentially align. So when we look at this spaghetti network, this mess in the top right-hand corner of these two scanning electron micrographs, knowing where those fibers are in the local context, we can see where they are, sort of hides from us the fact that they're biased in their orientation. And it turns out that when we look at the mechanical properties of paper, shown in the lower right-hand corner here, we have stress, which is the force divided by the cross-sectional area or thickness of the paper times its width. And then strain is how much the elongation, how much extension we're seeing. And you can see that the black curve has the machine direction. That paper goes up higher. It's stronger than in the cross direction. And this general bias is a byproduct of the fibers being aligned more along the machine direction than the cross. But what's interesting is to then think about how processing the paper is going to change the properties. In the case of the two images at the top of this micrograph, the one on the left has fillers to make it nice and bright and white copy paper. On the right-hand side is a cellulosic filter paper, which has none of these extra additions to it. And understanding how fillers, sizing, and even ALD types of processes can impact the performance of our paper as we expose it to our use case. In my group, we use something called Strainfield Mining, which is glorified image recognition and face tracking. So if you've ever sat looking at the back of your phone or your camera and you have it set up so that you're going to keep faces in focus as your dog or kid or kitten, if you're getting ready to post it, is moving around the screen. And the ability to identify a feature and track its motion is the heart of what we use in my lab. So shown at the top here is a strip of paper, and printed onto it happens to be a bunch of little dots. You'll see on the right-hand side here, we have little black dots that are marked with a little red cross, and next to them is a little blue dot. And what we've marked here is the motion of the different parts of the paper. We can do this with specific features, and we can even do it with just the native piece of paper that's plain because there's enough contrast that we can see visually. And by tracking the motion of these different features on the surfaces, we can extract information that tells us about what is the local motion of the paper doing, what are the local mechanical properties. And shown in this little heat map below is the distribution of the axial strain. So this is how much it's stretching along the long axis of the paper. And what we can see is this nice red hot spot where the strains are getting concentrated as a byproduct of the local fiber network structure. And what we're doing here is searching for the proverbial needle in the haystack. We have a mass of fibers that are heterogeneously arranged all over the page, and we don't know which arrangements of fibers are ultimately going to be responsible for failure. And so by doing these kinds of measurements, we can reveal local defect characteristics and the mechanical properties of the paper. And shown here in this lower image is actually a large strip of paper that has a notch cut in the side. And we can see on the right-hand side here a picture of what the strain field looks like ahead of the crack tip. And this kind of information allows us to say important things about where are defects and how do they grow, because then we can see cracks that your eyes cannot see. So in this particular case, we have a series of optical images that where we've done some strainfield mining. And so on the top image is a notch that was cut with a razor blade. So if you are into using your automated cutting tool, whether it's a Cricut or other scrapbooking kind of equipment, or whether you are more into the Sharon Schnitte style of work and you want to do it with an X-Acto knife freehand, more power to you. But in our case, we cut them and then we pull on it, and ahead of the notch here, and it's backlit and frontlit, you see all these little fibers stretched across. And the question becomes, with a material like paper, where the network is stretched across that crack, maybe it's broken, but you can't tell anymore. And this is a byproduct of the fact that it's a fiber network structure and the way that light interacts with those fibers. The cool thing is that we can take this picture, we can compare one picture to the next as this crack is growing, and we can come up with a heat map here of the strain distribution in the material. And we can mine this strain field to tell us about where is the damage, and we can identify how long is the crack, and that's what's shown here in this red. And the moment that we have the ability to identify where damage is and how it's growing, we can then go back and close that all-important loop for the structure-processing property relationship. We can explore what is that particular arrangement of fibers that makes the paper strong or makes it weak. So what I've tried to share with you is a perspective on what the role of fundamental research is in circular product development, because ultimately what we're trying to do is use imaging and analysis techniques and experiments in the lab to help us understand how the structure of the material is controlling performance. Because as we measure individual fiber properties and we're able to look at how those properties of the fibers change within use, as well as the product goes out and then returns in the product stream for reuse, we can then envision all sorts of important possibilities. We can imagine in engineering the fiber network with even higher degrees of control so that we can optimize our packages for exactly the kind of life and performance that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Again, another wonderful presentation. We're going to close the presentations with Meisha Shofner, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
So I am also very happy to be here this evening to talk with you a little bit on my perspectives on fibers. And I've also been glad to be part of the Renewable Bioproducts Institute here at Georgia Tech, which is really a great place to try to find interdisciplinary research partners and also interact with the folks at the museum, which is a wonderful thing that we have on campus. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how natural fibers are part of this family of natural polymers. So many natural fibers are made of natural polymers. My own research is really in the field of polymer science, so this is how I like to think of them. So just to start with a few definitions, because I find those are helpful just to put us all in the same place. The term natural polymers is kind of a larger umbrella term that means polymers or plastics, you may think of them, that are bio-based, and they can be synthesized by either nature or by humans. So then if we were to take that overall categorization and split it out, we would have biopolymers. And so these are polymers that are actually formed by a biological system. And so these would be things like cellulose, also proteins, keratin, silk, other kinds of natural materials you may be familiar with. And on our other side, we'd have bioplastics. And so bioplastics are materials that are derived or made from natural materials or chemicals, but these are not really made by a biological system. There's some intervention by humans. And depending on where you sit kind of in this categorization, you may think that bioplastics have to be biodegradable, but there's a whole other camp of folks that don't think they necessarily need to be biodegradable. But kind of the short way to think about this is that biopolymers are produced naturally or by a biological system. Bioplastics, while made from natural components, are still produced by humans. Another term that gets used somewhat, which just to put it out there, so folks will sometimes speak about biomaterials. So that term biomaterials can be a natural material, but it doesn't have to be. Often we use that term when we're talking specifically about materials that are used in a medical device or some kind of environment like that. But sometimes we do use that phrase biomaterial. So natural polymers have been around for a long time. They predate the use of synthetic polymers. So if we accept that the first real synthetic polymer was Bakelite, which was produced in the early 1900s, then we've been dealing with biopolymers and bioplastics for much longer than that. So kind of in this family of natural polymers, we can think of things like cellulose derivatives, so nitrocellulose, cellulose acetate, other kinds of materials that start from cellulose but then are chemically modified in some way. Natural fiber textiles we've been using for a long time. Natural rubber, which not a fiber, but still a natural polymer. And then casein, which is a protein derived from milk, which was used for a while to make things like knitting needles and buttons, and that we don't use so much anymore. But these materials have been in use for some time. And paper, of course, as we know, has been around for quite a bit longer. Within this realm of natural polymers, the one that we use a lot in the Renewable Bioproducts Institute is cellulose. So cellulose is a polymer. So it is composed of molecules which have a chain-like structure, just like our synthetic polymers. So things like polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, polystyrene, all the kinds of things that you put in your recycling bin. Cellulose has a structure something like that. So it has a long chain molecule. It's made of glucose. Starch is very similar to cellulose, but just a little bit different in terms of what kind of glucose is its building block. And we find this material everywhere, as you all probably know better than me. So kinds of natural cellulosic fibers, we find it in cotton. So cotton's a very pure source of cellulose. Linen and hemp, thistle, wood, very frequently, And then also things that really aren't plants, but bacteria, algae, and there's even an animal that produces cellulose. And as we think about kind of using cellulose, we can think about modifying it in order to produce it into films and fibers. So things like cellophane and other textile fibers can be produced by something called the viscose process or the lyocell process, where basically taking cellulose and chemically treating it or dissolving it in order to spin it into a fiber and then turning it back into cellulose. And then kind of material that my group has been working with for a while now is nanoscale cellulose, which is also sometimes called nanocellulose, and Mark mentioned it in his talk as well. And these materials are basically derived from the cellulose fibers that we find naturally. So we can think about, kind of one common visualization of where we find cellulose in a native fiber is in a plant cell wall, is what this diagram is here, just kind of exploded out to show you the different layers. But this is pretty much what we would expect for a wood cell or some plant cells. There are kind of numerous walls, which are what's represented by these kind of striped looking sections. And within these sections, these lines are representing cellulose microfibrils. So cellulose fibers that have kind of a width dimension on the order of microns. And inside these cell walls, it contains these cellulose microfibrils. And then those are encased with hemicellulose and lignin to hold it all together. And you can see that there's kind of these different orientations depending on what cell wall we're looking at. So we can take these microfibrils and we can deconstruct them into smaller objects, so nanoscale objects. And the two primary kinds are cellulose nanocrystals and cellulose nanofibrils. So I'll tell you a little bit about nanocrystals, which are the materials that we work with primarily, and many people at the Renewable Bioproducts Institute do. So if we could visualize those microscale fibers like this, so we can see there's all these kind of lines that run along the length of this fiber. Each of these lines would be a molecule of cellulose. So these glucose units arranged in a chain-like molecule. And so they're lined up and they go through regions where they are very highly aligned with one another, and then regions where they have a little bit more disorder. So if we're thinking about a material that we would like to incorporate into something like a composite or other kind of structural material, having these areas of just very nicely aligned molecules should lead to nice structural properties. So if we want to get them out of the microfibers, then often what's done is they'll be treated with an acid, many times sulfuric acid, and that sulfuric acid will preferentially destroy these disordered regions, leaving behind these ordered molecules, which are like little needles made of wood. And we can produce these cellulose nanocrystals, also called CNCs, from a variety of cellulose sources. So we can get them from wood, and wood is one of the most common places to get it. So there's a nice kind of manufacturing supply chain in place that produces pulp. And so many times wood-derived CNCs come from pulp. Tunicate, this is the animal that produces cellulose. It's a sea creature. Algae and also bacteria. If we look at these wood-based cellulose nanocrystals, we can see they are quite small. So they have roughly square cross-section. So they're about 3 to 5 nanometers wide, 3 to 5 nanometers high. And then the length is something on the order of about half a micron or 500 nanometers. If we look at the other sources, so tunicate, algae, bacteria, these can be much larger and longer. So the kind of nanocrystal we get depends on where we're sourcing it from. But wood is pretty common in terms of the research that gets done with nanocellulose or cellulose nanocrystals because it is very abundant in supply, whereas it's a little bit more difficult to get tunicate and algae. There's some scalable pathways for bacteria, though. So if we think about kind of how we got to where we are with these materials now, they have been known for a while. So as people were trying to understand the structure of cellulose fiber, one thing they did was was subjected to acid treatment or an acid hydrolysis. And through that process, they ended up producing these nanocrystals, not that they were trying to necessarily use them as a finished material, but rather just as a way of understanding structure. And you can see kind of an image of those fibers as produced from these papers around 1950. It took a while for people to think about using them. So one place that people did start to use them and is kind of aligned with the sort of research we do in my group is looking at how to use them in composites. So basically taking the nanocrystals and incorporating them into a polymer, which we call matrix. So this is just kind of like a continuous polymer phase with nanocrystals interspersed in there. And so one of the first groups to do this was based out of France, and they did their work in the mid-90s, looking at kind of water-based polymers, kind of like a paint material, and incorporating tunicate cellulose whiskers, so these materials that came from the sea creature. And we're looking at kind of how the mechanical properties could be improved, or the strength and the stiffness of these polymers by including these nanofibers. So similar to how you might think of using carbon fiber or glass fiber to produce a composite, but just at a much smaller scale. Other people started using these materials once wood-derived cellulose nanocrystals became more available. And so around the mid-2000s, more groups were looking at this, and then we kind of ran into this crisis of naming. So if you're doing literature search for these materials and you want to go back to this time period, you need to search many different terms. So there's nanocellulose, cellulose whiskers, nanocrystalline cellulose. Some people calling them cellulose nanocrystals, but then also nanocrystals, but with a different abbreviation. Since that time, there's been some ISO standardization of the naming, and most of the community has agreed that we're going to call them cellulose nanocrystals, which makes life a little bit easier. Production of these materials became much larger in just after 2010. So one of the first places this happened was a company called Celluforce, and Celluforce is a joint venture between Domtar is a paper company, and FP Innovations, which is a Canadian research company. And the two of them got together to produce, or to kind of put together this manufacturing plant, a small-scale manufacturing plant, that was essentially bolted onto a pulp mill. So they're using the pulp from the Domtar pulp mill to produce their nanocellulose. And that was in Canada. And then in the United States, the Forest Products Laboratory, which is part of the U.S. Forest Service, opened their pilot facility in Madison, Wisconsin in 2012. And they formed a partnership with the Process Development Center at the University of Maine to distribute some of these materials. They've gotten out of that business since then, though you can still get materials from them, you just can't purchase them in the same way. And today, kind of with this availability, we're seeing many more folks interested in using cellulose nanocrystals in composites and other kinds of products. So it's been used not only as a filler in polymers, but people have also looked at it as an addition to cement, which can improve the flexural properties. People have looked at it as a rheology modifier, so basically changing the way fluid flows, and cosmetics, inks, all kinds of different applications for these materials. So just to kind of finish with something that we've been working on, and this is part of a larger group at Georgia Tech, so this has been a collaboration with Carson Meredith in chemical engineering, who also serves as the executive director of the Renewable Bioproducts Institute, and John Reynolds in chemistry. And we were looking at how to use these materials to help make bio-based packaging materials. So flexible films that you might see in food packaging or other kinds of clear flexible packaging. So a common material that gets used here is something called polyethylene terephthalate. So if you recycle your plastics, this is the plastic that comes with the #1 symbol on it inside the triangle. And so this material is quite prevalent. It's very good as a packaging material, but it's not, as a film, horribly recyclable. It's a little difficult. So what we were looking at doing is trying to take a bioplastic, so polylactic acid, which you may have heard of before. So this is produced oftentimes from chemicals derived from corn. It can be made into a film. It's clear. It's kind of noisy. Ever had a packaging material of polylactic acid film? It can be kind of noisy. But for a barrier application, the noisy part's not important. What is important is that it doesn't have very good oxygen barrier, which means it lets a lot of oxygen through. In comparison to polyethylene terephthalate or PET, it's quite high. So what we have been looking at is how to modify the barrier properties of polylactic acid by including more natural polymers. So basically coating these materials with cellulose nanocrystals, so taking the polylactic acid film, putting a coating of cellulose nanocrystals, and then also a coating of chitin nanofibers, which is a different kind of bio-based nanofiber derived from, at least in our work, derived from crab shell waste, but it also can come from different kinds of mushrooms. And when we would put these layers on polylactic acid, what we see is with just kind of one layer, if this blue part is our PLA, and then have one layer of these chitin nanofibers and one layer of cellulose nanocrystals, we see that the oxygen permeability decreases quite a bit from this uncoated material. And so it makes it competitive with the synthetic plastic of PET. So we're continuing this work looking at manufacturing schemes and also other kinds of bioplastic films that we can use. But just kind of an idea of how we have used cellulose nanocrystals. And if you're interested in reading more about it, the citation for the work that was published a few years ago now is available here. And as I mentioned, this is research that was supported by the Renewable Bioproducts Institute with 3 student fellowships. So Chinmay, Sadam, Cameron Irvin, and Gus Lang were all supported by the fellowship program. And so with that, I will end and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Meisha. Let's see, we do have a couple of questions here. This question is from Mark. Is this a closed system so that you can reuse the vapor?
Yes, I put a little bit of a longer answer in the text there, but I mean, it can be. I mean, the real point here is that in general, when we're doing ALD, the vapor is being consumed. So once we deposit it, it's now permanently chemically attached to the material that we're depositing on. And so, but the issue with, are we consuming all of the precursor, or is there excess that's going to waste? That's a serious concern when designing an engineering process that's efficient for consuming all the precursor. And there's a number of ways to do that, and I kind of mentioned them there. But yeah, so thinking about your use of precursor, your consumption is an important when you're talking about scale up and optimization of a process. Hopefully that answers the question. If they had follow up exactly what they were asking about, I'm happy to follow up on that.
I'll assume they'll type it in if they want further clarification. There's another question asking if can this have material applications in architecture? I'm assuming that was also addressed to you, Mark?
Yeah, I think that was after my talk. I saw it on there. I don't see any reason. I mean, again, I'm not sure if we're talking about the wood treatment or paper treatment or whatnot, but I mean, any of these, there's no reason they couldn't be used in architectural applications. I think the limiting factor is potentially the scale up of the process to handle sizes of products that you would use in architecture. But there are sort of roll-to-roll kind of processes that exist or are under development. The advantageous thing here, and the reason that we continue to study this and think about manufacturing with this, is that we find that we get these change in properties with just a single atomic layer or maybe 2 atomic layers. And so it only requires sort of a single exposure cycle, whereas even in microelectronics, when you're putting down these coatings, you're usually talking 50 or 100 cycles, which is quite a bit, and that takes a lot of effort, especially if you have to coat a large quantity of material. But here we're only doing it really one time or maybe twice. And so because you're using so little material and you're depositing so little and only requires one exposure cycle, that actually makes it much more tenable to scale up to sort of these sorts of sizes for things like building and architecture and so on.
This question is for Meisha. You mentioned that the nanocrystals can be sourced from several different places: tunicate, the algae, the bacteria, and wood. Is there a difference do the crystals have a different property based on where you're sourcing them from, or can they be interchangeable? Like you source from wood or from somewhere else, and then you no longer have access to, or may not have access to that source. Can you substitute from one of the other sources?
So you can. In the kinds of places we use them, so we use them in composites. And so in composite materials, we want them to have what we call a large aspect ratio. So they're quite long in comparison to how wide they are. And the different kinds of nanocellulose have different aspect ratios. So the tunicate has a very high aspect ratio and will give you beautiful properties in a composite, but it's not incredibly scalable to produce. So you can't necessarily get that same level of property from a wood-based cellulose nanocrystal, but you can get more of those. So part of what we do is trying to understand kind of where the wood-based CNCs are useful. And in the barrier properties, they are very useful because in those applications, we're looking for them to form a very dense film. And so when they are shorter, it's easier to get them to arrange into these dense films. So it kind of depends what application you're looking for, which one might be best.
Thank you. There's two questions here for Chris. The first being, have you looked at fibers other than wood pulp? I'm thinking about popular graphic papers made from primary cotton or bast fibers that are stronger and have much lower acid or lignin content. Curious to know how those paper products break down differently in the cycle.
So we usually switch between different flavors of paper, including the fiber types as well as how they're manufactured. And the short answer is that by changing the fiber type and the other details of that sheet, there can be a pretty profound impact on how damage is going to evolve in the paper. And so it's a pretty exciting and fun thing to be able to do, to switch between papers that are manufactured from natural fibers and also to switch over to synthetics. And ultimately, the role of a lot of these additional layers, whether it's a coating or whether it's an ink or something else, is where some of the most complicated and challenging problems come, because the moment that you add those additional layers, you've taken what was a complicated fiber composite and now you're adding on top of it additional layers that impact how the environment is primarily going to interact with. So it's an important part of what we do.
And then the other question was, what are the possible uses in the space industry?
So in terms of the technology that we're using to monitor damage accumulation, the possible applications in the space industry are really in the mechanical performance of materials arena. In my particular case, we have a center that's funded by the National Science Foundation where we look at composite joints. And these are bonded joints that are made from either metals or composites. And essentially, we're looking at glued together structures. And so one of the classic things that we'll do is we'll monitor how the deformation and strains and damage are accumulating both within the adherents, which are oftentimes fiber-based composites. Maybe they're continuous and woven, or maybe they're discontinuous like paper. And then there's also the glue in between. So this is, in the literature, going to be referred to as digital image correlation. That's the general class of the technique. And it was originally developed in the 1970s and 80s, in the earliest days when we started hoping to have decent digital cameras. And really, once digital imaging became commonplace, where the high-resolution phones and everything else just eliminated the barriers to capturing those images, we now see it all over the place. And so That's how these technologies are used across all different sorts of systems. And then finally, the last thing is that I was talking about two-dimensional or planar cases. Now they do it in 3D. And so you can image something in 3D and track the motion of large structures and how they change shape.
So this question is for Mark. How long does it take to do this layering? You're talking about these multiple layers, and can you give us a sense of like how long it takes you putting these things in these chambers?
Yeah, it can be fairly quick, in the order of a few seconds to sort of do a single exposure and get complete reaction. Now, I'll caveat that by saying, if you want to do a stack of papers, that becomes much tighter, and so there's ways to either agitate the material or keep it sort of dispersed enough that the gases can easily get between sort of tight spaces. But if you can manage that, if it's pretty open for the gases to flow through, it's pretty quick, a few seconds per cycle. And bigger pumps will get you to do things faster. So.
And then in terms of, Chris mentioned that circular cycle. So when these fibers, like you making something hydrophobic, and then wanting it to be able to be recycled or reused or broken down, does it require a different process? Because
this is something I'll mention that we've been looking at a little bit, like a few of these atoms, how they can trigger biological responses of enzymes or even bacteria. So we've seen, for example, if we put down a little bit of zinc ions, this can trigger bacterial responses, and we can vary if the bacteria likes it or doesn't like it depending on how much we're putting down, because we can put very precise amounts down. We're also looking right now at how it triggers the enzyme cellulase, which is what basically decomposes, biodegrades cellulose, and how, if we can use these inorganic atoms we're putting down to trigger different responses for biodegradation. So these are things that we're actively looking at. That's very interesting, and potentially we can control with these things. Besides the wetting, there's a number of other properties we could potentially control.
Oh my goodness! I just went blank. I had a question for Chris, and it just left my head.
Well,
I'm
while
sorry
you
about
are
that.
thinking of that question, Jerusha, we had a question very similar to your last one in the chat for Meisha, which is how recyclable are all of these materials, and does it take more energy to recycle?
So I think for the bio-based options, it's very likely that we would be looking at not recycling them, but rather biodegradation of them. I don't know if it takes more energy or not. If part of things we're looking at right now are how to deconstruct these materials so that we maybe could reuse some of the coating materials, but I don't know, like in the case of a polylactic acid or other bioplastic, we would necessarily be looking to recycle that.
I did remember my question, but we've got one that was added to the Q&A, and we may end on this question just because I am mindful that we've gone a little over our time. What efforts are being made to complement the mechanical process for processing fibers into packaging with a recycling machine specific to that specific process? Newspaper does not degrade in our lifetime in a landfill.
I can say it's outside of my area of expertise, and so we'll let Mark jump on that one.
That's true.
It's a good question.
I'll just mention one thing, I think in recycling and around recycling in general is that there is opportunity not just in the science and technology, but in the sort of the social science of recycling and sort of teaching the public on how to, separate their waste and their recycling streams, because that's actually the real challenge with recycling is getting streams to go in the right directions. And, you can do it technologically sometimes, but if you can get public policy to do these things, it may actually be easier than the technological methods to do them.
Well, thank you all. This is very, very informative and engaging. I appreciate you guys breaking it down for us. And I encourage folks to come and check out our exhibition. We don't necessarily go into full detail on, oh goodness, this is going up, making me go all the way through. Full detail on these particular topics, but you can hear a little bit more or see a little bit more of the fiber samples that we had in the fibrary that was part of the Institute of Paper Chemistry and later Institute of Paper Science and Technology. Just want to thank our presenters tonight and let you guys know that we have a couple of upcoming programs. We have a virtual demonstration and lecture on bark paper for Tuesday, March 8th from 7:30 to 8:30 with Lisa Miles. And on March 4th, actually before the bark paper, which is part of the programming for this exhibition, on March 4th, Friday, March 4th from 8 to 9, we'll be doing screening for Fast Film Fest, and it's original short format paper animations. It's just a lot of fun. You can see what people have created and weigh in on the People's Choice, help us select People's Choice Award. If you enjoyed tonight's programming and would like to support future programming from the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking, we welcome donations, and those can be made. Anna, can you switch to the next slide? Those donations can be made to the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking Support Fund. The link will be placed in the chat. And if you want to stay up on future programming, you can either visit our website at paper.gatech.edu, or you can email Anna. Anna, will you give your, I know you usually paste it in the chat, your email address, to get added to our mailing list. Once again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and thanks to our presenters. Yeah, I think that's it for tonight.